On this episode of This Week in Linux, we check out some distro news from Peppermint OS, ArcoLinux, LuneOS, and IPFire. We got a couple apps to talk about like Nextcloud and a new wallpaper tool that has quite a bit of potential. We'll take a look at what is to come with the next version of KDE Plasma. Intel users have gotten some more bad news regarding their new security vulnerability. Later in the show, we'll cover some interesting information regarding a couple governments saving money by switching to Linux. Then finally, we'll check out some Linux gaming news, and all that and much more coming up. I'm Michael Tunnell with TuxDigital, and this is your weekly source for Linux GNews. Before we get started, I just want to make a quick announcement that I'll be at the Southeast LinuxFest conference that's coming up in June. It'll be happening between June 14th and the 16th. This is a Linux conference that is like it's an interesting conference because it does have talks and it has keynotes and that kind of thing, but also it has like a lot of social aspects to it. There's even parties that happen at the end of each day. So that's pretty cool if you're wanting to check it out. I'll be there giving a couple talks at Self, as Noah of Destination Linux and Ask Noah Show will also be giving some talks. And the rest of the DL crew, Ryan and Zeb, will also be at Self this year. So definitely, if you're interested or you're in the area, you should totally come check it out. It's free to attend as far as getting into the venue, but you know the travel expenses and that kind of thing. There's that maybe depending on how far you have to come. But I'll be at Self this year, and we'll be doing some meetups as well as we'll be doing a live recording of Destination Linux at Self. And I will probably be doing something with This Week in Linux at Self in some aspect. I probably won't do it live just because of the timing of it, but I will probably be doing something, somehow. I haven't decided what I'm going to do for this show on there, but something. But we will be doing a live for Destination Linux, so if you want to, come and watch it live and hang out and go to the meetup, that'd be great too. You will June 14th through the 16th. SoutheastLinuxFest.org. A version of the show this week is there's a new vulnerability for Intel users. It's called Zombieload. It is a micro-architectural data sampling vulnerability. So, it seems another exploit is out that impacts Intel and not AMD. Apparently, Intel is, just rampant with these at this point. But Zombieload is a side channel attack that allows hackers to retrieve data being processed inside the CPU. So it's kind of like Spectre and Meltdown in a way, but Zombieload takes advantage of the speculative execution process in a different way than the other ones do, and it impacts every CPU from Intel starting from 2011. So all of the CPUs since then are all affected. The exploit is running at hardware level, and it can overcome privacy barriers users may have set up due to this hardware level issue. The only good news about this is Intel's already released mitigations for the vulnerability, but they also have another caveat in the fact that they have some performance costs. So Phoronix has been doing benchmarks on the mitigation patch, and it's been showing measurable performance hits in every benchmark that he's run on these mitigations. You can check Phoronix for updated impacts throughout the week or so, because for the past few days or so he's been doing testing in a variety of different ways. One thing that was interesting is that the gaming is not really affected by this issue, but other things are heavily affected in a variety of ways. And some things are not super affected, but they've said that one suggestion would be to turn off hyperthreading, would allow you to have another benefit of the security, having a mitigation without hyperthreading on. However, to point out that one of the reasons why Intel's has a good performance in the past is because of the hyperthreading. So if you turn off hyperthreading in Intel, it's kind of like, what's the point of having Intel, right? So interesting enough is that Mac users are hit the most on this particular thing, because they were hit by like up to 40% of performance loss on just using their computer overall. So that's unfortunate for them. We're not at the 40% level but it's still not good because it is significant performance issues. And when you combine that with the Spectre and Meltdown issues, there's some significant hits. And interesting enough, if you're an AMD user, AMD CPU, only Spectre is actually affected for AMD. And also not all of Spectre is affected. So no Meltdown and no Zombieload for AMD users. So I have decided that my next CPU will be an AMD CPU because at this point, I bet there's probably 3 more of these coming out for Intel based on this track record. But anyway, it's also kind of funny that there was actually a recent kind of a little bit of hype around a new distro. Not new, but new as in new trending distro called Clear Linux, created by Intel. And I saw some people saying AMD should take their initiative and make a distro specifically for their hardware. And that kind of made me, smirk a little bit because sure, Clear Linux is designed to be the best optimal usage for their hardware. But AMD's focus is making hardware that's not susceptible to all these broken, weird vulnerabilities, and therefore I'd rather have that. So, and also the fact that AMD's got all their stuff in the kernel and everything as well for both the GPU and the CPU, so you have better experience with using AMD hardware at this point. Now, NVIDIA versus AMD, that's definitely debatable, of course, but at this point, Intel's giving no reason to use their hardware. Let's move on to some good news, because there's plenty of that in this episode. Up next in the show is Nextcloud 16 has been released. Nextcloud 16 is now out and introducing a powerful new feature, machine learning, which is pretty interesting because the machine learning is being used for security and allows for detection of suspicious logins. Additionally, it will be leveraged to offer recommendations to help users find what they're looking for as far as like files, based on your track record of using the system and like what files you open most often and that kind of thing. They also have added access control lists or ACLs in group folders, allowing admins to fine-tune control over who has access and to what. So, and you could have specific controls over a folder, allowing multiple people to get into a folder, but then also have control over different files inside of those folders so that only the people you want to have access to this stuff could get access. So that's pretty cool. They also have a new privacy center that lets users see where their data is and who is accessing it, which is awesome because I don't know if it's real time. I haven't tested it yet, but it looks like a fantastic feature whether it's real time or not. But if it was real time, that'd be much better. Nextcloud is probably the go-to solution for replacing services like Google Drive and Google Docs if you've never heard of it before. Also, it's a replacement for Dropbox and that kind of thing, as well as like Calendar and Contacts and all that. It's a really cool application and solution, and with this machine learning structure, it could make it so much better depending on how well this works out for the security and the usability improvements for and also where it stores this information, because they haven't really said so, but I'm pretty sure it stores on your own setup, but I couldn't find the actual details for that one just yet. In the future, I'll do a touch up on that topic if necessary. But anyway, Nextcloud 16 is really cool, and it's available right now. Up next in the show is Peppermint 10 has been released. Peppermint is an interesting distribution because they have a combination of various different good things from different aspects of Linux. So, for example, they merge various different components between XFCE and LXDE desktop environments, as well as they have some stuff from Ubuntu, some stuff from Linux Mint, and they kind of merge different things together. And they also create their own unique stuff as well. So it's really cool because this particular one is based on 1804 LTS, and it's using the hardware enablement stack. So it's got the kernel 4.18 instead of the 4.15 that came with the Ubuntu 1804 release. It has 4.18 because that is the one that's available in the hardware enablement stack. And it will also be getting the 5.0 kernel that's available in 1904 as soon as Ubuntu pushes that to the stack. or the hardware enablement stack. So Peppermint's also benefiting from getting that stuff too. So that is very cool. They've also implemented the thing that 1804 did with that proprietary NVIDIA graphics driver installer. So when you click the install third-party drivers software stuff, it will automatically detect if you have NVIDIA driver or NVIDIA card to automatically install those drivers now. So they're benefiting from that as well with this new upgrade. So that's awesome. But there's one thing that's really cool about Peppermint is they have this ICE system. And ICE is a single session browser that it's a structure to create web apps that are desktop-based web apps. So it's essentially kind of like taking a website and turning it into a desktop app, but sort of not exactly, you know. But the reason why it's cool is because it also has like integration with, you can customize it really easily. You can change the icon. You can change, like you can get notifications with the desktop. You can get, you can use different browsers to implement this structure. And this particular update is really good because for a long time you could have chosen Chromium, Chrome, or Firefox. However, Firefox was the only one that allowed you to have isolated profiles for those SSBs, and you couldn't do it with the other browsers. However, they have now added Vivaldi as well to that browser list, and they've made it possible to have isolated profiles for Chromium, Chrome, and Vivaldi. It is pretty cool. The ICE structure is a really interesting idea, and it is available in other distros. Some people have ported it to other distros, like Arch has it for sure. I don't know how many other ones would have it, but it is a pretty cool idea. So if you've never tried Peppermint at all, it's definitely worth a shot. And especially with Peppermint 10, you have a lot of benefits from it. With the hardware enablement stack, the having third-party drivers easily accessed, getting SSBs, it's a lot of things to check out, and I think that it's definitely worth giving it a shot. So if you want to learn more about Peppermint 10, I'll have a link to it in the show notes. Up next in the show is the beta release for KDE Plasma 5.16. We're going to cover a lot more in depth in the future when 5.16 comes out, but I wanted to cover the latest stuff because there are some very interesting things like at a top level interesting that I want to cover before we get to the actual in-depth release in a future episode. So first of all, there's some new settings customizations for the color scheme and the window decoration pages. So they've been redesigned to be more consistent and it just look better. But what's really cool is they now have it gives you the ability to filter your themes by light themes and dark themes. It makes it a lot easier to find out which one you want, or if a particular theme supports light or dark. They also made it so that Plasma Network Manager now is compatible with WireGuard, which is awesome. They've also made it improve the support and reliability for app images inside of Discover, so that you can now install applications or app images from store.kde.org directly inside of Discover. And there's been a lot of stuff on the desktop management side of it. So Plasma Vaults can now be locked and unlocked directly from Dolphin. They've improved the structure for the Plasma theme switching, so it's more consistent and it brings in more of it switches more components without having to do much effort. You just choose a different theme and it would just move more stuff and much more cleaner. So that's really cool. They also have done a really interesting thing with the show alternative section. So you can now go into the panel edit mode and then right click an individual widget and it will show you alternatives to those widgets that are also available for Plasma. So that is awesome because there's a lot of widgets available that people aren't aware that they exist, many of which are just by default available in Plasma, but there's also a ton that are in the KDE store. So that is a really cool addition. And I haven't actually tried that out yet, but I look forward to seeing how they're going to implement that because that has a lot of potential. Also, they've also made an improvement to the system tray so that if an app is recording audio, a microphone icon will appear in the system tray, which allows for the changing and muting the volume with a middle click or the mouse wheel much easier. So if you are wanting to take a break from recording a podcast, for example, you could just click that button and then do so. Like I could have just done right here, instead of having filler words like this. Anyway, the Most important thing so far, I think, is the completely rewritten notification system that has a lot of improvements. One of the things that they added was the do not disturb mode. They also added a more intelligent history structure by grouping different notifications together. So if you get notifications from like specific applications, it will group them all together. Or if you get notifications from KDE Connect, it will group them that way. A lot of different improvements to that. They've also made it where critical notifications are able to be going through full screen apps. So this makes it possible that if you're using a full screen and it's like a critical notification that you need to get, it will still display to you. So, or you can choose to have it display to you, not necessarily force it or anything, because Plasma doesn't force stuff. But anyway, there's a ton of other things that are available, and we'll go much more in depth in the next episode. The next episode we cover Plasma on it, or KDE Plasma 5.16. But for now, if you would like to check out the beta, I'll have a link to their blog post in the show notes. Up next in the show is the latest release of IPFire Firewall. This is version 2.23 Core Update 131. This particular release has a lot of bug fixes and performance improvements. There's a couple things I wanted to talk about specifically. First of all, they have SSH agent forwarding. This now can be enabled on the IPFire SSH service, which allows administrators to connect to the firewall and use SSH agent authentication when using the IPFire as a bastion host and connecting to other internal servers. There's also a new intrusion prevention system. And this is pretty cool because they've actually replaced the existing system, which was called Snort, and they've replaced it with Suricata. I'm not really sure how to say it, but I'm going to guess it's Suricata. So this changes the way they do the preventions, intrusion prevention by it now deeply inspects packets and prevents threats, making your network more secure. And the developer of IPFire says this in the announcement. It says the new system has many advantages over the old one in terms of performance, security, and simply put, more modern. We would like to thank the team at Suricata, on which it is based, for their hard work in creating such an important tool that is now working inside of IPFire. So that is pretty cool because they're doing like a collaboration with Suricata as to implement it. And if you haven't checked it out, IPFire is a really good firewall distribution that you might want to give it a shot. I'll have a link to this latest blog post in the show notes below. Up next in the show is the latest release of ArcoLinux, which is 19.5. There's a lot of stuff in this one. Like they've been doing releases for the past about every month or so. They've been making new releases, and there's a lot of stuff that's coming in this latest version. It's interesting, but for the most part, it's mostly maintenance improvements and bug fixes and that kind of thing. But they do a lot of customization through a lot of different desktop environments and window managers. So one of the things that's actually kind of a little negative is that ArcoLinux B is the branch of ArcoLinux that has pre-made community-ran distros or ISOs, and they've decided to eliminate those distros, those ISOs, and focus more on the development and the learning through building your own system, because ArcoLinux is kind of like a learning tool for Linux. So they kind of give you like multiple phases. So you have the phase 1, which is just get ArcoLinux and installs and has the defaults of how they want to use it, and then they also kind of give you like a smaller one where you can get kind of dabble into creating your own ISO. And then they have another one which is like much more bare bones, where you're in phase 3, you're actually building the system much more closely rather than using the scripts. So it's an interesting approach because their purpose is to have a good distro, but also at the same time be a learning distro. And it's a distribution based off of Arch Linux. So there's also a benefit to using the Arch as a learning platform, because you can do that with just Arch itself. So there's a lot of interesting and cool things about ArcoLinux. We actually have Destination Linux did an interview with the developer of ArcoLinux, Eric Dubois, quite a few episodes ago. I'll have a link to that in the show notes if you'd like to check it out. But it's pretty interesting distro. However, this latest version, they've announced that they're no longer going to be doing as many ISOs, because at the time they had 13 different desktop environments or window managers as options for these ISOs. which also meant they had different architectures because they had, I think they had 32-bit and 64-bit, and that meant they had 26 ISOs to maintain and test and all that stuff. So they decided to do away with all of those and make it more about the learning again. So it's interesting, but at the same time, if you were using those, that might be a negative, but at the same time, I think the majority of, like, the biggest benefit of Arco is the learning aspect of it. So I think it's overall a decent thing. So there's also been a lot of updates to like Calamares and a bunch of other stuff, as well as like the customizations they've done to OpenBox and i3 and Awesome and a bunch of other things. So if you're interested in checking it out, I'll have a link to 19.5 of ArcoLinux in the show notes. Up next in the show is some interesting information about some different government institutions that are implementing Linux in a variety of different ways from various governments. And first up, we're going to talk about an Indian state called Kerala. I think that I butchered that for sure. I know I did. Anyway, they've decided to switch to Linux, and they've also found that they've saved a lot of money. The schools are expected to save roughly 3,000 crore. That's totally wrong. I'm sorry. But in USD terms, that's actually converted to $428 million. So that's a pretty good move. If you're going to save that much money by switching to Linux, I mean, you definitely should do so. This is also really interesting because they have a strong education policy in this district, and they've also set up mandatory IT classes for all of the kids in the school. So they're able to learn Linux now because they're implementing Linux everywhere for the youth. Every teacher will be trained on Linux and the educational software so that they can teach the kids, as well as, in these IT classes, as well as just using the software in general. The savings comes from the ditching all the licensing fees that they say amounted to $50 million per year. The vice chairman had this to say: if you had gone for applications of proprietary nature, if we had gone, each computer would have incurred at least 1.5 lakh, I don't know, or $2,200 in licensing fees. So there's definitely a lot of reasons to drop Windows, but this is one of the best reasons is the money. So if you can save over $400 million, it's a pretty easy decision. Anyway, it's really interesting to see what happens with the other neighboring states, to see if they would actually take the example and do it. So it's pretty interesting to see, and I can't wait to see more of this happening. In fact, we don't have to wait that long because the next topic is something also very similar. In other Windows Schmindows news, South Korea government has announced that they are planning a Linux migration. They're actually saying that they're doing it as the Windows 7 support ends, so next year essentially. While the initial cost of transitioning to Linux-based hardware will cost $655 million, they anticipate they will still have significant savings long-term with the licensing fees, and they will not be reliant on a single OS. So they could use multiple different versions of Linux based on what they need to use it for. Naturally, because one of the best reasons of Linux is that particular thing of choice and tailoring it specifically to the hardware that you're going to use it on. So interestingly enough, there are many organizations like the South Korean government that are still on Windows 7, which only has 1 year of support left. So this transition is maybe like a prime time for this to happen for a lot of different places. So if you are involved in some kind of institution or in some kind of organization that has this kind of situation where they're still on Windows 7 and are looking at the deadline of support for Windows 7, then you might be able to convince them in a much easier way to try out Linux, or at least to do a test bed of Linux versus Windows to see if they could benefit by switching, recouping various different costs like licensing fees and all that. So South Korea decided that they think that they can, so might be worth checking out for other people. Anyway, if you'd like to learn more about this particular news, I'll have a link to the South Korean government Linux migration, as well as topic previously where we talked about the Indian states school switching over. So yeah, I'll have a link to both of those in the show notes. Up next in the show is a really interesting wallpaper app called Superpaper. They've released 1.1.1 this week, and it is an interesting wallpaper manager that has a ton of really cool features, and it also has a nice GUI and user experience structure that there is some little bit of a caveat to it I'll get to in a second, but first of all, let's talk about the features it has. First, it allows you to set a single image across all displays, set different images on every display. You can have pixel per inch correction, so you can span an image flawlessly across different displays of different shapes and sizes, regardless of what the resolution is. It will automatically move, like it'll basically check out what the image is and then like kind of cut it up and move it around based on the resolutions that you have provided on your monitors. So it's really cool idea because it automatically does this kind of cropping and setting up everything so that no matter if you look in the video version of this particular episode, there is a horizontal monitor and a vertical monitor right beside each other, and you can see that the wallpaper has been nicely like cut between the two. And in most cases, doing that would be awful if you do it like manually, or in most DEs don't really support that level of control. So this is a pretty cool application just because of that concept. And they also have bezel correction. So if you have really big bezels, it kind of like tries to compensate for that in some ways. So that's really cool. It has a lot of stuff like a tray applet for slideshow controls. If you wanted to move your, change your wallpaper more often than a lot of people do, like if you want to have like every 10 minutes or so you want to change, it can do that. And in theory, also automatically adjust based on whatever your orientation is. So that's pretty cool. They also have like hotkey support for the slideshow control and all this. So it's a really interesting piece of software and has a lot of potential. Unfortunately, I could only find a build for Arch Linux and also the source code to compile it yourself. I couldn't find builds for most distros. So maybe they're just working on the functionality and that they'll then package it for other distros, in the future. But I think if this was available on all the distros, this would be a really, really cool solution because it has a ton of potential. And but if you do happen to use Arch Linux or are okay with compiling it yourself, I have a link to those in the show notes below. Up next in the show is LuneOS running on a Pinephone dev kit. This is really cool because this video is essentially showing off LuneOS using the accelerated graphics enabled for the Pinephone's dev kit. And this is very cool because it also looks very snappy and responsive based on how it's the interface is working. And if you're not aware, LuneOS is a Linux-based mobile phone operating system, and it also works on tablets as well. But the reason why it's as cool is because LuneOS is a port of WebOS. WebOS is an operating system that was created about 10 years ago now, actually. And it was, my favorite operating system for the phone ever. It was way better than Android. It was way better than everything. It was also based on Linux, like a legit, genuine Linux operating system, not just like this weird Android Frankenstein thing. It actually was a Linux-based operating system. And they also had a lot of open source tools inside of the system. They used a lot of open source technologies like web stuff for applications and all kinds of things. So it was a really, really good operating system that was handled and managed by a company that fell on its face because they made very bad marketing decisions and bad business deals and stuff like that. So WebOS essentially died. It was sold. The Palm itself was sold to HP, which was then HP then kind of fumbled the ball on WebOS as well. And the guy who wanted to ship the WebOS as part of their various devices then got fired, and they had a new CEO come in, and they just decided to get rid of WebOS completely and sell it to LG, and then LG turned it into a TV system. And anyway, LuneOS has a lot of potential because it has the benefit of being WebOS, but at the same time being a community-ran port of WebOS. So that's why I put it in the show, because I'm a big fan of WebOS, and I'm glad that it is still being maintained, even if it is in a port version, because it has so much potential, and I look forward to the day that I will be able to use WebOS or LuneOS again, because the operating system was great. Just for a quick note, if you're curious about what I said about the marketing, WebOS or Palm showed off. This was, by the way, but this was back then when Android didn't have the ability to multitask, but WebOS did, and Palm showed out how they did the multitasking a year before the phone was actually available to be used. So during the process of the time where they announced it at CES, and then the phone actually became available, Android had stolen their ideas. So that's just, bad marketing. You're going to talk about something that's innovative and really cool, but not let people have it for a year. So yeah, that makes sense why they didn't survive that. Anyway, if you'd like to learn more about LuneOS, I'll have a link to it in the show notes below. Up next in the show is some gaming news from Valve to start off. Valve issued some updates for SteamOS, Steam Client Beta, and Proton. So first off, we're talking about SteamOS. There's a lot of security updates and improvements to their firmware of their non-free updates. They've also updated their Mesa drivers to 18.3.4, the NVIDIA drivers, as well as some other security updates. Then we're going to move on to the Steam client. This is a recent update. It's in the beta still right now, but one of the updates is really cool in that they've actually renamed the in-home streaming structure to Steam Remote Play, because now instead of just requiring you to be at home, you can now stream games to any other client, both inside and outside of your home. The next interesting bit is that Vulkan have reworked their shader system, so it's now capable of downloading and precompiling the whole collection of Vulkan pipelines for games. So this will make it possible for like the shader data downloads in Steam and precompiling will be enabled in a much faster, will make the Vulkan rendering a much cleaner thing, which would improve not only just native Vulkan games, but also could improve the functionality of Steam Play and Proton. And speaking of Proton, Valve also updated the latest version of Proton with 4.2-4. This updates DXVK to 1.1.1, which is the latest version. They've also improved the better icons, and they fixed controller detection in some games, and they fixed some issues that Wine was getting stuck on depending on when you're upgrading Proton to a newer version. But it's also worth noting that due to all of this work from Valve, which thank you Valve, by the way, and all the work from co-weavers and Wine team working on Proton, the ProtonDB website, protondb.com, is now reporting that over 5,000 games work with Proton on Linux. They currently list 5,006 games as of this recording, and that is awesome. I don't really know exactly which ones are gold, how many are gold, and how many are platinum, but the fact that there's 5,000 games on Proton, thanks to Proton, where before that we didn't have as many, and now we used to have I think a total was 5,000 games in general on Linux, and thanks to Proton we've now doubled it within less than a year. Because I think it was August that Proton was announced, so it hasn't even been a year yet, and it's already doubled the amount of games. That shows that Proton is a fantastic improvement to the ecosystem. So yes, thanks to all the people that are working on it, and I can't wait to see what's happening with the new Vulkan support with this, the shader stuff to make Proton even better. And also, there's more companies that are getting interested in Proton because of all this stuff, and also Vulkan because of all this stuff. So that's awesome. If you'd like to learn more about this, I'll have a link to the Gaming on Linux article in the show notes. Up next in the show is some really interesting information, not necessarily Linux related, but potentially could be and could benefit Linux in some ways, depending. We'll see, because it's like a 50-50, I guess. But Sony and Microsoft have announced a strategic partnership where they're going to collaborate on new cloud-based solutions for gaming experiences and AI solutions. The two companies will partner on new innovations to enhance customer experiences in their direct-to-customer or to consumer entertainment platforms and AI solutions. These two companies will explore joint development of future cloud solutions in Microsoft Azure to support their respective game and content streaming services. I don't know why they say it like this. This is text taken directly from Microsoft's blog, and they talk about Microsoft and Sony and like this weird third person thing. So like these two companies. And anyway, in addition to this, they are also going to be doing using the Microsoft Azure data center solutions for Sony's game and content streaming services, as well as Sony's going to allow Microsoft to use like semiconductor and their intelligent image sensor solutions and stuff with their stuff. So it's really interesting because now you might be thinking, why do we care? One, it's interesting that they're even doing a partnership because they've been known to hate each other for decades, especially with the console wars. Azure heavily uses Linux. Like Azure Sphere is specifically a Linux-based distribution that is powered by Azure and like IoT stuff. Then also Microsoft Azure is like 51% or so Linux powered. They do have Windows nonsense stuff, of course, because it's Microsoft. But the reason why this is potential but interesting because this is essentially a competitor to Google Stadia. And Google Stadia is the gaming streaming platform that Google announced where they're going to be using Debian and Vulkan to provide game streaming. And this is essentially the same thing through Microsoft and Sony to do content and game streaming services and that kind of thing through Azure. So if they were to be using Linux in the back end to do this, which is probably likely because Linux is the most popularly used server structure, period. It's even with Azure, it's one of its most popular thing that is run through their platform. It's possible that it could be a huge bonus to Linux. Now, the reason why is because the Google Stadia also being using Linux, and we already know for sure that they are. In addition to if Microsoft and Sony do it, that could be a big bonus to Linux gaming. But we don't really know what's happening outside of this blog post because this particular piece of news was released earlier today during recording. So I don't really know exactly any details because they didn't give any details, of course, because it's Microsoft and Sony. But I think this is still pretty interesting. So if you'd like to learn more, I'll have a link to the blog post in the show notes below. Up next in the show, and the last topic for this week, is id Software is going all in for Vulkan. Now, this is not necessarily Linux specific, but they are talking about having a lot of support for Vulkan, which means a lot of support for Proton, which is a lot of potential for Linux gaming. And there's actually a conference that they went to. They had different talks about Doom and Proton and some other stuff. Is also like why they are switching to Vulkan as well as talking about Linux in general. One of the slides from that particular talk actually had a slide that said why Linux, and the answer to that slide was it's not Windows, which I think is pretty funny and also very true because Windows. They are heavily going into Vulkan. So they're still going to be working on Linux. They're going to do Linux support because of the Vulkan. It automatically gives it. Because with Proton, the thing about Doom 2016, which came out, it was one of the first games to have Proton support because of the heavy usage of Vulkan inside of Doom 2016. So by having that support with Vulkan, they made it possible for Proton to easily work with it. And that's what they're talking about with their latest game engine, id Tech 7. So they say everything uses Vulkan now. And by that, I mean everything. The engine, id Studio, even our helper tools. Everything that we have uses Vulkan now. And he said, so at least for all future games that are being made for id Tech 7 will be using Vulkan, and they should also, not necessarily default, but Steam said or Valve said that in order to have support for Steam Play and Proton, if you develop with Vulkan in mind, then you don't really have to do much to make it work. So because they are all in on Vulkan means any of their games or any of the games using their engine should work with Proton fairly easily, if not automatically. So that is awesome. There's also some news about the so we talked about earlier Google Stadia. There's also some interesting news about Google Stadia, and that is Google has kind of given some more information about what is going to be used, and most of it is open source. Not all of it, but most of it. And that is libGGP, and some other stuff like, the game itself wouldn't be open, but everything else would be. It'll be using Pulse Audio, Vulkan, libc++, glibc, and of course the Linux kernel. So doing this, this combination of all these different factors of Google Stadia using Debian, having Vulkan as the main powering of these games, the game streaming, and having companies like id all in on Vulkan makes the Linux gaming scene a much bigger player than people even look at it right now. Like, it has a ton of potential to explode in the next couple years or so to be a massive platform. And what's really interesting is that getting a game on Stadia itself requires prototyping on existing Linux distributions like Ubuntu or Debian. So in order to get that to work and then having it work on Stadia, it also has to automatically work on Linux, which has a ton of potential, and I am looking forward to the future of Linux gaming, especially to get all the new, latest and greatest AAA titles and whatever coming to Linux. There's actually potential with all these different factors combining together that it could happen fairly soon, and I can't wait for that. So if you'd like to learn more about this particular article about id Software going Vulkan, I have a link to the Gaming on Linux article about it in the show notes. Thanks for watching this episode of This Week in Linux. If you like what I do here on this show, please like that smash button and be sure to subscribe. If you'd like to support the TuxDigital channel, we have multiple ways to contribute via PayPal, Patreon, sponsors, and many others. You can learn more by going to tuxdigital.com/contribute. I should totally add the sponsors part to that page because right now it's not displaying it. I'll fix that next time. Anyway, you could also order the Linux is Everywhere t-shirt by going to tuxdigital.com/LinuxIsEverywhere. Or if you're in Europe, you can go to tuxdigital.com/LinuxEverywhereEU for shipping inside of Europe. We also have ways that you can contribute without any cost to you by using our affiliate links. You can find links for places like Amazon, Private Internet Access, and many others by going to tuxdigital.com/affiliates. If you'd like to submit some good news to the show, then you can visit the subreddit by going to thisweekinlinux.reddit.com. If you'd like some more podcasting goodness from me, then check out the latest episode of Destination Linux, as I'm a co-host of that show. And just a reminder that this show is live usually, I don't even know. This time it was live Sunday. Usually it's Saturday, but the past week or month it's not been live much. So let's just say it's usually live sometime. Next episode I'll probably have a better idea of when I'm going to do it. So thanks again for watching. I'm Michael Tunnell with TuxDigital, and as always, keep using, learning, and enjoying Linux.